We're very pleased to have as our special guest the ambassador from Canada, David MacNaughton. David is native of Canada, obviously. He went to school at University of New Brunswick, got his degree there. Though, as he told me, he could have gone to Princeton, but he decided to stay in Canada. He had a distinguished career in public affairs and public relations, owned a number of companies, one of which controlled Hill & Knowlton for a while, and then he ultimately sold his company to WPP. He was the co-chair of the Liberal Party's campaign for Prime Minister at the Ontario part of the campaign, and that resulted in the Prime Minister currently, Mr. Trudeau, being Prime Minister, and he was appointed ambassador not too long thereafter, and he served here and presented his credentials to President Obama in March of 2016. So, do you think it's appropriate that the Canadian ambassador should apologize for invading the United States many years ago? This happened, I guess, in 1814, and other times you invaded our country. Have you ever thought of apologizing to the American people for that?
Well, you know, given the fact that we are clearly identified by President Trump as a national security threat today, you know, I think if he got rid of the steel and aluminum tariffs, I'd probably apologize.
Okay. Well, speaking of that, are you surprised that we regard it as a national security risk that you're importing steel and aluminum into the United States?
You know, the whole thing is really quite ridiculous, and you know, if it weren't serious, it would be funny. I think that, you know, what we were able to do during the whole NAFTA negotiations, notwithstanding the rhetoric that was going on, is we were able to keep our defense and security relationship separate from the tension around trade. But this steel and aluminum tariff business that uses 232 that identifies Canada as a national security threat has caused Canadians to really not just from an economic point of view feel upset, but it's an insult, you know, for a country that's been an ally of the United States for so long. It really is causing those lines to be more blurred than I'd like, because frankly, at this time, Canada and the United States need to get closer together from a security and defense point of view rather than have the kind of tension that's going on. So I hope we can resolve this soon, because it's a serious problem.
Have you noticed a difference between dealing with President Obama and President Trump?
Slight.
The difference. So on the trade negotiations, right now, USMCA was agreed to, but it requires the Congress of the United States to approve it. What do you think is the likelihood of that happening?
You know, I think that when it comes to a vote, it will be approved. I think the question really is when will it come to a vote, and whether the Speaker decides to you know, put the question before the summer recess. I'm hopeful that happens, because I think the uncertainty around you know, what the rules are going to be in terms of, you know, this trading relationship, which is huge in North America, I think we need to settle that down. And I've spoken to lots of members of Congress, and I really think that the USMCA is a significant improvement over NAFTA. It's not perfect, but there's some elements in there that even you know, Democrats, some of the Democrats who've been anti-trade should look at that and say, you know, in the rules of origin in auto, you know, there is something, you know, which is $16 an hour component of it, that certain amount of the parts and the automobiles need to come from plants that have $16 an hour labor. That doesn't exist in the existing agreement. So I think, you know, on balance, it's a good agreement, and I hope that it does get put to the House and the Senate before the summer recess, and that it gets approved. I think it's in everybody's interest.
If it's not approved, do we go back to we stay in the current agreement for a period of time, and then it has to be renewed by Congress, I guess?
Well, I mean, you know, if it's not approved, presumably the existing agreement stays in place unless one or other of the countries invokes the termination clause, and then you create another whole level of uncertainty.
So in the last couple of years, have you seen an increase in visa applications from people in the United States who want to move to Canada? Does that happen, or?
I mean, the answer to that is that we've seen quite a few. What's happening in Canada at the present moment is that we have embraced immigration. We think it's a strength of our country, and we've set a target of 350,000 immigrants a year. You know, for a country of 35 million, that's pretty significant. Because one of the things that, you know, I like to say now is that Canada has been recognized for many, many years as for its natural resources. And I think what we're beginning to see is businesses that are recognizing Canada for its human resources. We've got a diverse workforce, we've got a talented workforce, we've got good universities, and we are trying to attract the best and the brightest from around the world, including the United States. And our universities, some of our top universities have had increases of 75% in terms of foreign students wanting to study in Canada. So yeah, I mean, there have been Americans, but there have been people from all over the world who come to Canada.
The Canadian economy is growing at what percentage now, would you say?
Well, last year was the largest, it was the highest growth rate in the G7 countries, but it's slowed down a bit now. So it was over 3 last year. I don't know what it's going to be this year.
Okay, and your biggest export, is that energy related?
Yeah, I mean, autos to the United States and energy to the United States are the 2 biggest exports.
And the Keystone pipeline, so-called, is that likely to actually happen? And what will you do if it doesn't happen?
Well, I think it will happen. I think it's you know, I've been working with the administration on trying to find ways in which we can get more of our crude to the U.S. You know, if you look at what's happening with Venezuela, the Gulf refineries that depend on heavy crude, that's one of the things that we have. So I think Keystone's going to happen. I think that we will get the Trans Mountain pipeline built. Okay. So I think we're going to get our resources to market.
Some people, environmentalists you might call them, would say, well, the tar sands where your oil is, to remove that oil from the tar sands, it involves more use of energy than is the case when you're getting other kind of energy. Is that a legitimate argument, and is it really contributing more to the carbon in the atmosphere by using tar sands oil?
Well, actually, what's happened in the last several years is the real story about the Canadian energy sector is the innovation that's taken place, and that in fact we put a cap on emissions from the oil sands. The new Suncor production out of the oil sands is 5% lower emissions than the average barrel of oil in the United States. So we've made significant strides, and we've put a price on carbon. And I think that the reality is, I was out in California a while ago, and I had some environmentalist who was attacking me over the tar sands. And I said, you know, when you decide to have a price on carbon in the United States, when your oil in California meets the same emission standards as ours from Alberta, you can talk to me about it, but until then, please be quiet.
Now, you have 35 million people, right? What percentage of them speak French principally?
Principally, I would say 25% as their principal language.
And those people who speak it principally, are there people, let's say in the Quebec area, who speak it only
yes.
speak French?
Yeah, there are. When you get outside of Montreal, Quebec, Quebec City, there are people in outside of those cities that only speak French.
So do you think it's possible to be Prime Minister of Canada if you cannot speak French?
I think it'd be really hard to become prime minister if you can't speak French.
So the Quebec separatist movement of years ago, is that dead and dormant now, more or less?
You know, I think what's happened is many young Quebecers have become much more interested in the globe. They're you know, entrepreneurs in Quebec who are looking at the rest of the world as their opportunity, and as such, I think they've become much less insular in terms of their view. So you never can say in politics that, you know, that kind of thing is dead, but certainly right now, you know, the separatist party is at its lowest ebb in many years. So I think it's good for the country.
Okay, so when did you first meet the Prime Minister?
Oh, 6 months after he was born.
Really? And you think he was going to be Prime Minister then or not?
Well, his father certainly thought so. My first trip to Washington was with his father when his father was Prime Minister. I was working for the Foreign Minister, and we stayed at Blair House, and I had lunch with our Foreign Minister and Henry Kissinger at the State Department. It was a fascinating opportunity. But yeah, I knew the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, before this Prime Minister was born.
So did the Prime Minister ever think that he would be seen as the mature, experienced person in the U.S.-Canadian relationship? He never thought that?
Yeah, that's probably something I shouldn't answer, actually.
Okay. So while you've been in meetings with the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States, how are those meetings go?
Well, you know, the first meeting was extraordinarily positive, and as was the second. The one at the G7, so basically what happened was I had to have back surgery 5 days before the G7 meeting. And so when everything went badly, I phoned the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and said, you know, I leave you guys alone for 48 hours and look at what happened.
Couldn't you have postponed your back surgery?
Well, yeah, I could have, but you know.
All right, so the President left that G7 summit, flew on to his meeting with, I guess it was Kim Jong-un, the first one, and he saw something on the TV, he didn't like it, he issued some statement, and has that all been cleared up now? Or?
Yeah, you know, the two of them have spoken several times since. They haven't had, you know, well, they did have face-to-face meeting in Buenos Aires to sign the NAFTA deal, but no, it's been, you know, they talk, you know, quite frequently, and it's been really quite civil.
Okay, so your new elections are going to be in October, and so you have any doubt that the Prime Minister is going to be reelected?
Notwithstanding the fact that I've been involved in politics most of my adult life, I have learned that you don't predict the outcome of elections 6 months in advance, particularly these days. So you know, I think it's, I think the Prime Minister's got his hands full in terms of the election, but incumbency has a certain advantage in politics.
So I grew up in Baltimore, and Baltimore was for one time the center in the United States of lacrosse, and so I used to go up to play games in Canada, and that is your national sport. How did lacrosse get to be your national sport and not ice hockey?
Well, I think it originated with our indigenous population, and it was something that people took up in Canada, became the national sport before hockey really became,
I see.
You know, the phenomenon that it is. I will also, as I said, remind you that basketball was invented by a Canadian, and so you know, it's one of the great contributions that we made to the world is not only lacrosse, but hockey and basketball.
Well, when I was playing lacrosse, we would go up to Canada, and I would just, for those of you who know something about sports back in the 1960s or so, the theory on sports in those days was that if you drank at halftime, you would get a cramp if you were running down the field later, so you didn't want to cramp up, so you just sat there and you just sweated, and that was what the theory was. When we played in Canada, we saw that they were drinking beer at halftime. And we said, they're going to be not only getting a cramp, they're going to be drunk. It turned out that it actually worked. They did better than we did, so we then adopted that policy. But anyway, that's one of the things we picked up in Canada. So right now, if I said I have a week to do nothing with, and I want to go to Canada to learn more about Canada, where should I go to Canada? What are the best things I should see in Canada as a tourist?
Well, I think that there are, what I would do is I would start in Newfoundland, and I would go to the Fogo Island, the Fogo Inn in Fogo, Newfoundland. I would then go to Cape Breton, and I would play golf at Cabot Cliffs Golf Course, which is one of the most outstanding golf courses I've ever played. I'd go to Quebec City because it's a wonderful city. Toronto because it's the multicultural place. I would, I hate to say avoid Winnipeg and Regina, but Calgary is, so close to Calgary, you've got the mountains, and British Columbia, Vancouver is a spectacular city. So it'd be tough to do it all in 1 week, but I don't think you can get a real flavor for the country unless you see it, from east to west.
Okay, let's suppose I said I don't have time to be a tourist, I just want to invest in Canada. Where would be a good place to me to invest? What are there certain industries you think are good?
Yeah, I mean, the whole artificial intelligence is one of the things that we have, really become quite good at, both in several locations. The whole Toronto Waterloo corridor, Montreal, out west in Alberta. I think cybersecurity is one of the areas but the technology field is one where, as I said earlier, the human resources of Canada are really outstanding.
Okay, so how did Canada get this site? I mean, it's a very nice site, not that you're not a great ally, but there must have been a lot of bidding for this site. How did Canada happen to get this site?
Well, we acquired the site in 1978. And it was actually a Ford dealership. And as you would know from those days, that this part of town was pretty scruffy. And there actually wasn't a lot of interest in it. I would like to say it was a remarkable foresight and ingenuity that Canadians are noted for. It may have been just luck, but Prime Minister Trudeau acquired the land. Got the architect, Arthur Erickson, to design it. It was opened by Brian Mulroney in 1988, I think it was. It is one of the great assets, because you'd never be able to do this today. I mean,
so as the ambassador of Canada, what is your principal responsibility now? Is it to deal with trade issues? Is that the main thing you're worried about with respect to the United States? I
think, well, clearly the trade issues are ones that I spend an awful lot of time on. The NAFTA negotiations were as difficult a period as I've ever been through in my life. I don't think I've ever worked as hard. I don't think I've ever, dealt with so many things that are not just challenging, but also are so important. I mean, they weren't just important from an economic point of view, but when you realize that what you're doing and what you're negotiating affects individuals and communities, it was really important. But in addition to that, what I've learned is that we share so much in terms of the things we do day in and day out at the border, in terms of security and defense and all those kinds of, working together on problems like Venezuela, North Korea, the Middle East. I mean, we are real allies, and there's so much that goes on day in and day out between our two countries that I don't think people really appreciate.
Well, did you send troops to Iraq when we had our invasion of Iraq?
Well, we in the first instance we didn't. We do have soldiers in Iraq right now running a training mission, and we're heading up the NATO troops in Latvia.
Okay, in Afghanistan, did you send troops?
We did send troops to Afghanistan.
And when you imposed tariffs, we imposed tariffs on your steel and aluminum because they were threatening our national security.
Right.
But you imposed some tariffs, and some people say the tariffs you imposed were cleverly designed to deal with certain members of Congress. And was that true or not true?
That would be a really mean thing for us to do, I think, wouldn't it be? I can't imagine picking things like bourbon or
In Kentucky.
yeah, in Kentucky. It would be.
So you wouldn't have thought of that?
Well, it just by accident it happened.
Okay, I just wondered.
And I mentioned the other day that we were just randomly thinking of refreshing our duties, and we were thinking about things like ethanol and pork and wine, but they just came into my head magically.
So what would you like Americans to most know about Canada? If somebody they've never been to Canada, they just know, about, a little bit about your ice hockey teams or your prime minister, but they haven't been there. What should Americans know, in your view, about Canada?
Well, I think most importantly, it is that Canadians and Americans share values, which is really important these days, I think, and that we are not only your best friends, but your closest allies, and also that, obviously we want the United States to be successful because it benefits us economically, but also I think that Americans are starting to realize that we are your most important market. We buy more from the United States than China, Japan, and Great Britain combined. And so your prosperity is in part dependent on our success too. We're joined at the hip, and we need to, so much of what we've done together it works so well that it hasn't been noticed. And so what we've been trying to do over the last few years is really to raise the awareness in the United States of, the fact that it's an integrated economy. We're important to each other.
And there's no effort to put a wall between us, right? No, you're not going to build a wall, right?
Every once in a while I wake up in the morning and think about it. I've been asked by a lot of people, are you going to write a book? And I have this thing, which is that when you are in a position of trust, when people bring you into meetings that are, really important, you don't go and write a tell-all book afterwards. But I do think I could write a book, and it might be interesting, and it would be entitled "The Tweets I Didn't Send."
All right, so you're not going to build a wall, right?
No, I don't think we'll build a wall.
And let me ask you, before we have questions from our guests, the head of your state, the head of state of Canada is who?
Is the Governor General.
What about the Queen? What is she?
Well, she is. The Governor General is the Queen's representative in Canada, and she is the head of state.
But why do you need that anymore? Because you're big enough to be your own independent country. We went away in 1976 or 1776 from Britain. Have you thought about just saying thank you and?
There are many in our country who would like to do that, but it's one of those things where. There's so many more important issues to discuss these days, and that one would be so contentious that it's probably not worth creating that kind of a fight.
All right, so you enjoy your job?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time.
Most of the time.
There are moments.
Was it more enjoyable, let's say, in the first year than maybe later?
No, it was very friendly in the first year, but the Obama administration was in the last year, and they were looking at legacy items, and we were in the first year of our mandate, and so it was friendly, but we didn't really get a lot done. Actually, our relationship with this administration has been quite constructive. I mean, we get along well with them. I mean, it doesn't mean that we agree. But whether it be Ambassador Lighthizer or Secretary Ross or Steve Mnuchin and our finance minister are personal friends. I mean, it's a good relationship, but we don't agree on everything.
Okay. So questions? Anybody have a question? Right here. There's one. Well, get the mic first.
How do you like Washington, D.C., as living here as a resident?
Well, I Washington is one of my favorite cities. My difficulty, just in terms of lifestyle here, is that my wife and kids are in Toronto. She actually, has to earn a living to support me in my. But no,
This is not a highly paid job?
This is
No.
well, it's not bad, but it isn't. It isn't great, and so she has her career. My kids, I have 4 daughters and 5 grandchildren. So I miss seeing them a lot. So I try to get back as much as I can. But I really like Washington. It's a great place. It's a beautiful city, and there's lots of history here. And if you're a public policy wonk and a political nut, this is like being a kid in a candy store. It really is.
Hey, Gary?
Thank you. Many Americans I talk to are very distressed by the turn the relationship has taken because of our president. How can average Americans express to you and to Canada that we really think you're our best friends?
Do you know, it was really interesting when the whole the dust-up happened around the G7. We had a phenomenal number of, just letters and emails and phone calls from Americans saying, we apologize, or we're sorry this happened, and we really value the friendship. And whenever I go around the United States, I get that kind of sentiment frequently, and the appreciation. So, and there are so many Canadians and Americans that see each other all the time, particularly obviously in the northern border. There are 400,000 border crossings a day between Canada and the United States. I think the most important thing you can do is to tell your members of Congress that they need to make sure that this relationship stays strong. But I appreciate the genuine sentiments that we've had. I mean, we have so many family relationships. My grandfather was an American who was one of 35,000 Americans who crossed the border between 1914 and 1917 to fight with the Canadian troops in Europe. And he met some woman over there, and my grandmother, and ended up living in Ottawa. I always wondered why somebody who was born and raised in California would end up in Ottawa, but obviously, it's always the same. It's a woman involved, so.
So, okay, right here? Yes.
Hi, Nelson Cunningham with McCarty Associates. Not to pick at a scab, but who won the War of 1812?
There's no doubt about that. We did, obviously. I was, the president was talking about how we burned the White House, but it was actually the British who did it, because we really weren't a country until 1867. So.
Yes, that is true. Yes, Mary?
The average age in Canada is 41 years old. I was wondering, what is the innovation, technology environment in Canada to address, middle-class jobs, healthcare, nationalized healthcare?
The Prime Minister, the whole campaign was based on trying to do something about middle-class jobs and incomes, and there were a number of measures that were in the first budget which addressed child tax credits for low-income people, and a variety of measures to try to raise incomes. Income taxes were raised on the top income earners and lowered for others. The difficulty clearly is that we are going through, a huge disruptive change in the economy, and it's affecting all aspects of society. I don't think we've got it right yet, but I think that there are, one of the one of the potential benefits on the second part of your question of a single-payer healthcare system is that we should be able to use things like artificial intelligence to drive innovation through our healthcare system and provide better outcomes at cheaper price. The problem really isn't technology. The problem is the whole governance structure within the healthcare system. But I think that new technology presents huge opportunities for us to solve some of the problems that are with the aging population and the kinds of potential increased costs to our healthcare system. But we haven't got it right yet. The other issue, obviously, these days is, if you don't have access to high-speed broadband, if your kids don't have access to that, you can't claim you have equality of opportunity. And so we've got to make sure that every Canadian, regardless of where they live, actually has access to that. So that technology presents some really difficult challenges, but it presents some huge opportunities too. And I think the real question is, how do you keep your whole public policy regime and your regulatory regime in a position where it incents innovation rather than holds it back? But that's tough because you've got existing players in all sorts of industries that are legitimately saying we need to have a level playing field. Let me give you an example. I was in Vermont last summer for the New England governors and Atlantic premiers, and they were talking about Airbnb and what kind of taxation and regulatory policy should be in place. And a premier of Newfoundland said, well, yeah, okay, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to stand in the way of technology like that, because tourism in Newfoundland's gone up 30% in the last year, because people can go to small communities that can't justify having a hotel or even a motel, but they can go and live in somebody's home so I don't know. I mean, it's the public policy environment over the next decade is going to be as challenging as it's ever been because of the pace at which change is happening. And how do you make sure that those who are going to be disrupted don't become as embittered as some of the people in the manufacturing industry in the last 15 years have become. So there are no easy answers, but there's opportunities as well as problems.
Now, Vermont has a lot of maple syrup, and you have some there too. And whose maple syrup is better? Do you think?
Ours is clearly better. I was actually, the governor of Maine was complaining not about maple syrup. She was complaining that we subsidize our blueberries. I don't know how you subsidize your blueberries.
Wow,
but,
okay.
But,
Okay, right here.
Hi, Rinthia Rost. So you've identified AI as the future, and you've identified public policy issues that will have to be determined so that AI is not as disruptive to the labor force as it definitely is going to be. So when you look at America's and our labor issues, our issues around, universal health or around guaranteed income and all the rest of it, what advice would you give us as we approach technology being the be-all and end-all of what is to come? And what have you already designed for yourselves that needs to be in place for AI to succeed?
Well, I think the most important thing is to make sure that education is the most important thing that we can give. And when I say education, it doesn't mean, the old definition of, once, okay, now I've got my degree, I don't have to worry about that anymore. I mean, we need to build resilience and into our population and lifelong learning and the notion that somehow or other, because you have this kind of a career when you're 25 years old, you're going to have that when you're 55, because most likely it isn't going to be the case. And so it requires a whole sort of change in thinking. But at the core of it is to make sure, the success of the United States and of Canada has been the notion that if you work hard and you get a good education, you can be anything you want. We can't destroy that. And we have to reestablish the feeling in our countries that our kids are going to be better off than we are, and that's taken a hit too. So it really is important that lifelong learning start to be part of our understanding about what society is about, and that is going to require a degree of cooperation between the public and private sector, because the private sector's got a real interest in seeing that kind of talent come out. I mean, when I talk to businesses, the most of what I hear is their challenges in trying to get the right kind of people. It's a human resource challenge. So that's what it's all about, I think.
Now, did you ever consider getting into politics and becoming prime minister yourself?
Yeah, I frequently thought I was going to be prime minister. The problem is I ran, and the public didn't think the same thing, which was unfortunate. I ran for public office in '95 and got thrashed, and decided that was the end of that.
Okay, right here. One second. Get a mic, which is coming there.
Joe Burdecki, Bernstein Private Wealth Management. Canada has had a great head start over the United States in the cannabis industry. How do you see that continuing, rolling out, the competition, the future, et cetera?
Emphasis on the word rolling out, yes.
I think there's been, I don't know how the whole cannabis market, in terms of the companies that are involved, how it's all going to settle out. I think there's going to be some consolidation, and obviously there are quite a number of states here that have legalized marijuana too. I was in Denver a couple of years ago before we legalized marijuana, and I was interviewed by the Denver Post, and they were asking me about trade, and at the end of it, the reporter said to me, "Do you think that Canada can learn anything from Colorado in terms of your legalization?" And I said, yes. That was it. I didn't elaborate. I just said yes. Anyway, the headline the next day was, "Canadian ambassador comes to talk pot and trade." I don't know how it's all going to happen. I know that at the present moment, the problem in Canada there has not been enough production of legalized marijuana, and so the desire to get the illegal elements of the market out of the market have not been as successful as we'd hoped, because we haven't been able to produce enough legal marijuana to keep up with the demand. So we'll see how it evolves.
But they told you why it was called Mile High City, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yes, Jack.
Hi, great talk we had here today. I'm Jack Evans, and I'm your city council member. Represent this area on the DC City Council. I'm with Mayor Williams, our former mayor, and we're just dying to know, how much did you pay for the Ford dealership here?
$4 million. And I think museum paid $100 million for their property. So we did all right.
Right, Gary?
Did all right.
Hi, Gary Nell with National Geographic. Climate change is obviously causing a lot of changes in the Arctic. Big issue for Canada. Shipping, economics, security. Could you speak to those a little bit and how you're approaching that?
Yeah, it's, there are a whole series of issues around that, as you say, there's the issue of the potential economic development there that hasn't been possible before. The preservation of the environment. We have, large indigenous population up there, how to make sure that they are both involved in any economic development that takes place, but also that we're protecting the things like, the caribou and others. So there's environmental issues that go beyond climate change. But also the security one is a real issue, both in terms of Russia and their establishment and growth of their military base in the Arctic, and also China is starting to look at the Arctic. So I think it's going to become an increasingly important issue, not just for us, but I think also with the United States. And what we have done is really talk to the Americans about how we modernize our NORAD defense relationship with a real focus on the Arctic, because I think it's way more than intercepting Russian missiles and having an early warning system and all that. There's a whole series of others. We do have, regular meetings of all of the countries that are around the Arctic, and it's actually been quite a constructive forum, and even the Russians have been, in the past have been moderately constructive in that, but I think the world is changing in that regard with the changes in the climate. So it's a tough problem.
How many provinces do you have?
We have 10 provinces.
10 provinces and territories?
And 3 territories.
And at the most northern part of your country, are there any people living at the very, very top?
Yes, we have very small communities, but there are mostly indigenous population.
Okay. And how do you get a Canadian passport if you wanted one?
Well, you have to apply, and we have certain standards that we.
You have to live in Canada for a little bit or something?
No, you don't have to.
Oh, you don't?
No, you don't have to. But if you're interested,
I
please,
might be
please,
interested. I don't know. Okay, I'll find out. I'll talk to you about it later.
Okay.
Okay, right here.
Thank you, Jeff Weiss. Jeff Weiss with Distributed Sun. So David asked a question about energy, and you have a large indigenous energy resource. You have another one. You have renewable power that supplies 17% of your power. We're at about 40%, so we're both doing pretty well. The largest corporations in the world are increasingly making statements. 160 out of the largest corporations in the world, including Canadian corporations, have announced publicly that they're going to use only renewable power for their electricity. How do you see that changing, and how will that help in Canada?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have, I met with the CEO of Hydro-Quebec 2 weeks ago. Hydro-Quebec has got excess power that it is looking to export to the United States. There are 2 or 3 projects going into the New England states that I think is going to make a huge difference. We are, each of the provinces have different, necessity in terms of their, it's obviously a lot easier to have electricity power in Quebec and Manitoba and British Columbia than it is in Ontario or Alberta or Saskatchewan. I think what we're trying to do is to be responsible from an environmental point of view and from a climate point of view. We still, think that it's important that fossil fuels are going to continue to play an important role in the energy mix, and what we're trying to do is to make sure that we are sound environmentalists, but not going so far over to what some of the environmentalists would want, that it actually doesn't improve the environment. Let me give you an example. The previous government in Ontario imposed a cap and trade system and discouraged the use of natural gas. There was a fertilizer plant in Ontario that was the lowest emission fertilizer plant in the world, and as a result of their policies, that plant was temporarily shut down, and the production of fertilizer to the market that plant was supplying came from China, from a fertilizer plant that was using coal. So I'm all in favor of renewable power and incenting renewable power in the system, and obviously we've seen the cost come down substantially. But I think that we need to be practical about the continued use of fossil fuels in a responsible way over the period of time, so we're not doing things that appear on the surface to look like they're environmentally sound, but actually at the end of the day are not.
So do you have any Green New Deals in Canada?
Oh, yeah,
that.
we've had several of them, but you know, it's a challenge.
So you have another appointment, so I promised to get you out by now. But my final question is, you told me you were a scuba diver. So isn't that, you're a Canadian ambassador to the United States. It's an important job. Is scuba diving safe for you to go down there and do that? And don't you worry about?
You know, I think it's extraordinarily safe. But I will tell you a little story about the dangers of the deep. And that was that my wife was actually certified as a scuba diver before I was, and so I learned. And my first dive with her, we got down and there were several black-tip sharks that were coming close to us, and so I was very brave and I went behind her. And when we got up to the surface, she made some derogatory comments to me. And I said, dear, don't you understand that I read in the book, probably National Geographic, that actually sharks attack from the rear, and I was just protecting them.
Well,
she didn't believe me.
Like
It's
that.
shocking,
Okay. So it's a safe sport.
It is a safe sport.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your hospitality.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.